All right, Holly, you're on.
Okay, so I'm Holly Shaw. I live in a little tiny village outside of New York City on Long Island. Um, I I I think I'm the senior here because I graduated in 1969 from Boston University School of Nursing, and it was really a magnificent experience. And my basic undergraduate baccalaureate work set the stage for everything else really that was to follow. Um, and I've had a continuous but disjointed career, some of need, some of want, and I've kind of learned how to survive and thrive despite great adversity. Right now, I have four positions. Um, I teach, I'm a full professor adjunct at a university here, and I teach mainly psychiatric mental health and community nursing, also doctoral and masters, but I'm really gung-ho on the undergraduates because I just feel like we need so much work there. I represent the International Council of Nurses at the United Nations, and that's been a commitment for many years, decades, and takes a lot of time and energy. It used to be all going into the city, which is arduous for me, about 2.5 hours each way on several public transportation vehicles. Since COVID, we've been virtual more, but we're still there in person, and I was there twice last week. I also I have a private clinical and consulting practice in primarily trauma and bereavement. I was really early in the trauma world, in the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies with then Marty Levine, Bessel van der Kolk, and have been to China on a mission with Bessel many years ago. And so my practice is kind of generic, but really highly specialized in trauma and bereavement across the lifestyle cycle, but especially young people. And I have a position at the University of Minnesota on the directorate of the International Nursing Leadership Center and as the director of the Center for Nursing Engagement and Leadership at the United Nations. And what I'm going to share with you today is, it's funny because I do this all the time, but I always do it very focused, for the specific audience. And Michael asked me to kind of talk about how I got here. And that's very different from that I'm here. I mean, that's a whole interesting story in itself. So how do I share my slides? Does anybody know? Do you know, Michael? I don't see
At
it
the
here.
bottom of your screen, you should see a
Oh,
green button that says share screen.
oh, right. Okay.
You
Okay.
hit that, and then it'll give you a big window, and then you select which of those windows to pick. And then in the bottom right, there's a button to choose.
Yeah, the problem is that it's not going, it's not giving me a oh, wait, maybe.
Why don't you hit share screen, and then
I
that
did.
button.
Yeah, now I'm just looking for the file,
Okay.
and
Is it open? You have to open it up before you share it. So if you go down to your tray and open the application, if it's a PowerPoint, actually open it up and then share it.
okay, that's an old one. Thank you for bearing with me. I usually say at this point, now you see why I was never an ICU nurse, because electronics and machines are just not my thing. Okay. So this is who I am. We've already been there, done that. Oh, at the UN,
Okay, now
I'm,
before you go, we're not seeing it,
oh,
so
you're
you haven't
not?
hit share. Go ahead to hit share.
Oh, sorry. I see that. I don't.
Do you have the PowerPoint opened?
Yeah,
Okay, so
Uh,
hit your share screen button, that green button at the bottom.
yeah, wait, let me make it smaller because it's not, I'm not seeing that screen, that, I'm still not, this is so frustrating. Okay, it's open, but
So in your Zoom screen, that's where you're going to find the share screen green button. You might have to open it up all the way.
I don't, it disappeared. Um,
You want to send me the PowerPoint? Let me open it up.
oh, um, I think so. I think that might be a good idea.
Okay.
I just, will I be able to control it then?
No, you just say next slide.
All right, because you're gonna have a heart attack when you see how many there are, but I go very quickly.
Well, as
Ha
long as there's no animation, it should go in the
oh,
email.
but
It'll
I
probably,
don't see, I'm not on the Zoom, I don't have the Zoom screen again.
uh-oh.
Uh, even though I hear you, how do I get back to the Zoom screen, would you say? Or is that an impossible question?
Um, without seeing it, you might want to
Yeah.
minimize whatever screen you're on,
Yeah, I did, but now I can't
and then
find,
on your tray down at the bottom, you should have the Zoom icon if you're using the application.
oh God, this is killing me.
But we could see you.
Oh, you
So,
can?
so if you could just send me that PowerPoint in an email, I can open it up. And then you just tell me when to go to the next slide. We can do it that way.
Okay, I'm gonna,
Hi, Rahima and Eleanor.
Hi, hi.
Good to see everybody.
oh, wait, let's see. Oh, no, that's FaceTime. Okay, I've got that back. Now, let's see if we can go back to. It has to be opened or closed for me to share it.
Open but you have to also be able to see your Zoom
Yeah,
screen.
I can
So
now.
open the PowerPoint, and it doesn't have to be in the slide mode. It could be in the edit mode.
Yeah,
And
it's open, but now,
now on the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be that green button called Share Screen.
yeah, but it's not coming up. Let me try this one more. Okay, it's open, it's Zoom preferences.
No, you don't need
Um,
that. That's not what you need.
Okay, it's just, it's right there. Let's see. Um. All right, once more, share screen, Microsoft PowerPoint. Oh, then it's granting access, privacy and security.
Don't know what that must be. The NSA has jumped online with us.
Okay. All right, I give up. I'll send it to you.
Okay. While you're doing that, can you move your camera down so we see more of you? You there you go. That's perfect right there.
I just rearranged things in here, so
Okay, so I'm looking at my email.
but I probably have to. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, because I lost you. I
We see
probably
you.
have to close the file. All right, I'm gonna try and send it to you. Oh, yeah, something is going on. It just kind of really knocked me off.
How about if we just skip the PowerPoint, you just talk?
Okay.
Just tell us, the idea is to give us an idea on where'd you start in this? You must have had some kind of inspiration or vision, and you must have run into somebody who said, hey, this might be a good idea, or just tell us about how you got started and then the journey to where you're at.
Okay, I guess that's what took so long. I had a really great education, and I'm still trying to send this to you.
Okay.
Oh, it's larger. It'll be sent as a Google Drive link. Is that okay?
Yeah, just send me the link. Yep.
So I went to Boston University in the 60s, and it was a time of really great turbulence and all kinds of stuff going on. And it really was very formative because my education was formed around all of that social unrest. And my nursing professors were really engaged in those dialogues. And there was a recent survey of baccalaureate nursing of college programs to determine which is the toughest, the hardest basic baccalaureate undergraduate program among all majors, and it was nursing. And it was based on number of hours, number of tests, number of projects, all of that stuff. And for us, it was really true. So while many people were out demonstrating and, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, we were really caught up in many aspects of our clinical work. Okay, I sent this to you. Let's see if you got it. And so my basic formative years were really spent that way. And the one key link that was dormant for a long time was in a clinical. I was at the VA and very excited to be there because we heard from our peers that there were all these interesting old men from World War I, World War II, and it was a really fascinating experience. Except my patient was a 19-year-old Vietnam vet, and that was really tough because we were the same age. I was from a small town in Connecticut, he was from a small town in Massachusetts, and he told me a lot about, in those days, clinical was, twice a week, all day long, and for a whole semester. So I really got to know him. He was actually injured by friendly fire. He was caught in an electrical fence, and his buddies had to get the fence off by hitting it off with their rifle. And so they injured his skull in doing that. And he had right-sided paralysis. And he was 19 years old and kind of nowhere. He came from a really strong military family. He wanted to, I was a peacenik and still am. He wanted to go to Vietnam and kill gooks. That's really what he was focused on. And in the talking that we spent together, he said, one day I was in a village, we were doing an operation, and I heard some little girls laughing. And it sounded like my little cousins. I almost thought they were there. I wasn't psychotic, but the laugh was the same. And then a few days later, we were in another place and I heard an old lady crying. And it reminded me of my grandmother and my aunt crying about the death of my aunt's son, my cousin. And he said, all of a sudden I realized, holy shit, these folks are the same as I am. If I closed my eyes, I would have thought I was home. And he said, so I completely have a different feeling about my mission in life, which was to be in the military and kill enemies wherever they were. And the reality was that at 19, there were no facilities for him and his injuries, and he was going to a nursing home. And it was the bleakest possibility there could be. He knew he wasn't going to really get meaningful rehab. It was just so sad. And yet I was the same age and in such a different place, just being launched in life. And he said to me at one of our last meetings, you got to do me a favor. You know, you brought so much to me, you made such a difference, you made these weeks pass nicer, and I want to ask you a favor. And I, of course, as a good nursing student, said, I don't know if I don't think I can do you a favor. And he said, well, I want you to make me a promise. And I said, oh, I definitely can't make any promises. And he said, listen, you have great potential. He said, you got a big heart and you have great hands, because in those days we did a massage, you know, part of morning care. And he said, you can really make a difference in the world, in this world. And you can kind of be my emissary, you know, that we don't have to fight with each other. And he went on, and I said, but I'm just a nurse. I just want to take care of patients. And he said, the way you've taken care of me brought a sense of peace and stability to my heart and soul. And that kind of gives me some hope for where I'm going, that even though I'm off to a dismal future, I know that because of our relationship, you can carry on and make a difference. Please promise me someday the opportunity will arise and you'll step up and do it. And I said, yeah, I'll try. But that stayed within me for so many years. And I found that I did have opportunities much later on, and it all made sense and it all came into place. Did you get the attachment, Michael?
I just seen the email. There's no link there.
Oh, shit. Okay. So, my first job was at McLean Hospital, the greatest psychiatric center in the world at the time, a Harvard teaching facility. I had a wonderful, incredible experience. Milieu therapy was being developed. And it was,
Let me interrupt you real quick. I got the link. It came later. Now you have to authorize me to get it. So go to your email real quick and I think you have to do secret squirrel stuff.
okay, that I really don't know.
It should just be an email from that I want access, and do you allow me to have it?
Okay. Oh, it just threw me off. It's so ridiculous. Okay. Something's happening environmentally. So I went to McLean, had a great experience. Milieu therapy was just being developed. It was incredibly exciting. Not a strong nursing department in particular, and but a great psychiatric experience. And then I did what so many before me have done. I followed my husband to New York because he got a job in New York and we had to go. I was brought up in a way that New York was like going to hell from Connecticut. My parents wouldn't allow me to go to NYU, but they would allow me to go to Boston U. So I arrived in New York and really wanted to do a great nursing experience because I had this great psych experience. And I did that rather successfully, learned a lot, and then got married, had a child. Life changed. I had an NIMH traineeship undergraduate, and I was committed at some point to go back to school and get a master's in mental health nursing, which I did. Oh, good. Okay. And you can go to the next slide, Michael. And I started to pursue that. But my life started to take some turns. I was teaching part-time, and working and going to school. And I had a baby, my only daughter among three sons, who died. And that was a very shattering experience. And both my husband and I were very beloved at the hospital, but the pain was so enormous, they couldn't really even talk to us. So I always felt like there's no help out here for this kind of unimaginable pain, and someday maybe I'll be able to help that. Okay, so this is where I'm based so much of the time, and this is the iconic picture of the UN. I'm going to show you another more personal picture in the next slide. So this is, my school of nursing. I'm somewhere probably in the front, yeah, because I was always short. But this is how we were, caps that were affixed to our heads with a piece of toilet paper and a bobby pin. And, we had all of the traditional aspects of nursing in terms of patriarchy and obedience and all of that, but superimposed in a different contextual framework of social activism, social disruption, and all of that. Okay, next slide. So I quickly wanted to focus on bereavement. And by then I had another child who had a CVA when he was a couple of days old. He had a renal vein thrombosis and was in the NICU, and he's, thank God, fine, but multiply handicapped or disabled. But it just crystallized my view of bereavement and loss. And I had to really change course and get a whole new position because Alex was in the hospital for so long, and then he required appointments all the time. I couldn't teach anymore. I couldn't have a rigid schedule, and I needed to know something about pediatrics. And I got a job in the Division of Adolescent Medicine, and I was working as a clinical nurse specialist, in many ways, focusing on adolescent risk reduction. And I was working on a grant. I became very well known in the adolescent community as a resource. And so we began to have accidents where 4 kids would be killed. It just happened so often. And because my interest kind of dovetailed, a principal would call me and say, we can't teach, the students can't learn, we're devastated, we don't know what to do, we've never experienced this. Can you help us? And so I began to develop a program in adolescent bereavement that became very well known. You can go on now. I forgot what's next. So I did lots of presentations all over on adolescent bereavement and the contextual nature of development and those kinds of issues. And I became really well known in the Board of Education. I actually became appointed by the chancellor to start the first crisis response system in the city of New York. So when you hear on TV crisis counselors or bereavement counselors are going to the school, that was all my original work, which of course I didn't publish because who had time raising children and working. But it was a fascinating experience that that culminated actually in 1984, what we call the Great Adventure Fire, which was 4 kids were killed on a school trip of the 3rd largest high school in New York City at Great Adventure Amusement Park. And that work became really fundamental. There's now a documentary being done about it and probably a regular film, but it was an incredible experience and I learned a lot. And then went on, next slide. I was doing all of these presentations. I only picked a few. Keep going. Oh, let's do an international thing. So I began to widen towards an international view. And while attending a conference in Thailand, for which I brought my whole family, we did some health teaching in a very rural, what they used to call primitive village. And here we were doing, it was just a phenomenal experience. The next few slides. And bringing my family added a dimension. I always include that for younger nurses who have families and feel that they have to wait till they're 50, you know, to do this kind of stuff. But it's really very easy to do and safe. In those days, it was very safe and, you know, wonderful for the kids. Next slide. Keep going to the next. This is the whole family. Wait, back then. I'm sorry. I'm not such a good partner. So this is my whole family. At the time, my two sons, Alex is the one who's disabled, the little one in the front. We trekked, he has cerebral palsy, he's legally blind, he's got a heart, a lot of stuff, but these adventures were great. My older son is on the right, and the one in the middle is a 13-year-old cousin who wanted to join us. So it was an incredible adventure. And this was the day we were leaving this village and trekking through the jungle to go to another village. These people liked us a lot. We spoke a little Thai, but they spoke a native dialect. So we'd have to have a lot of trouble communicating, but we did. And they discouraged us from going to the next village. They said, oh, you won't like them. And we said, what? We're, you know, and they said, they're dirty and they're lazy and they don't like to work. And it was incredible to us that in this place with no electricity, no communication, no lights, no nothing, they still had this prejudice. And it was just so interesting to see. Next slide. The other thing that I really learned was this man is smoking opium. I have another great picture of a grandma holding a baby with a huge opium pipe. We were working on substance abuse at the time, and it was really interesting to understand the context. Everyone in every village we went to was addicted to opium, but it caused no problems. They didn't have to withdraw. They didn't have to steal to pay for it. It was, you know, among the poppies, and it had very few side effects, you know, being addicted. They just incorporated it into their life. At the end of a day, the teenagers would gather together and grind rice and socialize, and the adults would smoke opium. It turned out that I was pregnant at that time, and I didn't realize it until I was in Thailand, actually, and had some difficult times with the village chief who offered to smoke opium with me. And I couldn't say I can't because I'm pregnant, because they all did when they were pregnant. But it gave me a whole new view of substance use and addiction, and was very important in terms of the greater context in which so much of that occurs. Okay, next. Another thing that was really interesting, and I don't usually talk about this, is we stayed with villagers, and it was a mom, her husband, these twins who were about 2 at the time, another child who was 7, and her mother-in-law in a one-room hut. You can see the fire in the center, you know, that's where they cooked. And when we arrived to stay with this family, there were 2 dead squirrels right by the fire, and I got very nervous and thought, oh my God, there's some sort of horrible disease. But of course, our guide who was sitting in the back there said, no, that's the family's dinner. You know, that's what they eat. He brought our own food. But in the health teaching, this woman who was quite an individual, because she allowed us to stay with her. Most of the kids had never seen a white person before, and they were really fascinated. And because of my son's ataxic gait, they thought he was drunk, and they thought that was kind of amazing. But she kept telling me about a problem she had. She was dizzy, she was nauseous, and lightheaded. Now, what would you guess? Come on, MPs. I'm not an MP, but what would you guess was wrong with her? Well, we guessed pregnancy, and she insisted, no, it can't be. it just emphatically. And I thought, like, why? And she pulled up her arm and she kept pointing here. And there was a protuberance here that was quite, I mean, very palpable. And I just didn't have a clue as to what it was. But she insisted it couldn't be pregnancy. We ended up, there was an elderly woman who had an eye problem and it looked horrible. And we wanted to give them money to take the bus to the next town, which was very far, where she could be seen. And we felt that they needed some attention. They wouldn't listen to us, but they trekked. And when we got to, at that point now, it was many days later, to a city, they were there waiting for us. And it was really incredible because it was a city and they were dressed in this. The reason for her distress was she had an implant. She had the two babies at a health station, not a hospital, but a health station, instead of just a regular delivery by a midwife. And the health station implanted in her Norplant, a birth control method that was not being tested in the US because of the rigid restrictions, but was being tested on this woman who lived hours away from medical care. And the side effects were, could be disastrous in terms of bleeding and all of the complications. Her dizziness was from an ear infection. So, you know, they cleared it up right away, but it horrified me that these US, you know, corporations were experimenting on a woman like this, because the laws in the US really prohibited that kind of stuff. So it was, this really got me. What else are US pharmaceutical corporations doing around the world in ways that are treating people in a dangerous and harmful way? Okay, let's move on now. So that was fundamental. When I was saying about the publicity I was getting, then 1996, was the teacher in space and the death of Krista McAuliffe, among others. And I was the only person allowed in Concord, New Hampshire following that. And that was because I had worked so closely with the Board of Education, and I was trusted by principals and superintendents who said, you have to have Holly Shaw. And this happened a lot to me, where I was allowed into closed settings, because of my networking and because of the good relationships that I had, which to me was a fundamental aspect of nursing, is really knowing how to be a part of a team and how to facilitate best practices as part of a team. Okay, you can go on now. They're doing something big about my work there too. So I don't know, none of you are New Yorkers, but can anyone guess what you're looking at now? It's the Twin Towers. It's an old photograph. And 2001, I was already doing a lot of work in the Middle East around the Second Intifada, trauma, loss, bereavement. And I extended my stay that year because there was the Sbarro pizza bombing, and families and children were killed in the main tourist section of Jerusalem. And I stayed extra time to work with some of the journalists who were hardened war reporters, but the aspect of seeing children was more than they could take. So at the time, I'd been doing work in Israel. I fell in love with an Israeli who I stayed involved with for the next decade and a half, and he owned a restaurant. And so he gave me part of the restaurant, and I was doing trauma counseling in the restaurant. Finally came back. For the first time, I was glad to be back in the US, and I almost kissed the ground because I'd been exposed to so much danger. And within a week, the World Trade Center was attacked. Next slide. That still changed and still changed. I have lots of presentations about that, but I just kind of wanted to show you a little bit about how kids respond. And this was a boy who was about 7, drawing a picture of his family after the World Trade Center. His dad was a firefighter. And you could see that cognitively, he didn't really know what happened, But can you see this thing over the dad's head? That kind of meant something bad happened and he's not really here, but he's still a part of the family. Next slide. This was a 3-year-old, whose father was killed. He was a traitor, and they had friends who were also killed. She was practically nonverbal, but I don't know if you look straight at this picture, you can see buildings with a red thing around one, and that was, she knew that one was destroyed and killed the father. So I just had this enormous work of dealing with so many aspects of this. I live on Long Island. There were parking lots at the railroad station with cars for days from parents who didn't come home. I mean, it was just disastrous. Okay, next. So I began to talk a lot about trauma and loss. They hadn't really been connected before. The bereavement literature was one thing, trauma was another, and sometimes there was a conflict because my education now was developing in trauma as an autonomic nervous system response that was neurobiological, not psychological. And so you couldn't really do the loss and trauma at the same time. Okay, keep going, Michael. I know it's getting late. So I had this big transition. This is a man with a pad saying to a chicken lying at on a couch, "Why do you think you crossed the road?" And, you know, this was just a real change from my traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy orientation to, next slide, the more practical issues of how do you deal with such enormous pain. And Robert Frost said the best way out is always through. However, you know, nurses exemplify that, but other professionals, I think, don't know how to do this. So the fact that I could go through it with people who are suffering in a unique way was very extraordinary, especially then doing a lot of work in Israel. And I'd give a lecture to pediatricians or doctors or medical students, and they would say, "Why didn't I learn this in medical school?" And I would say, "Because you're not a nurse. You know, this is a nursing model of intervention." Okay, next. So I did a lot about, next slide, exposure to human suffering, vicarious traumatization. I pulled this out really because of what's going on now, just in the trauma sense. More facts of nature. All forest animals to this very day remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard that Bambi's mother had been shot. This is, you know, what we call a flashbulb memory. And it became, you know, very much involved in the trauma work I was doing, helping to educate people about why they were having these intrusive recollections and flashbacks. Next slide. And my guiding theoretical aspect, because there was very little then, was from Hemingway, who said, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong at the broken places." And that became the framework for all of my work in bereavement and trauma, both in New York, nationally and globally. Next. So that brings me back to the UN, and this is my personal shot taken. There's one train a day where I can, after taking 2 trains, instead of taking the subway to the city to get across this water, I can take a ferry. And so this was taken by me. I love the picture on the ferry getting to the UN. So now we're talking about how I got involved in the UN. I'd been there for several years before, but next slide, please. This is Karen Moran, who then was the president of Sigma Theta Tau International. And she asked me if I could facilitate a relationship between Sigma and the UN. And that became a real focus. I was representing my university at the UN in civil society. And it took about a year, probably more than a year, to really facilitate that relationship. Next slide. And then I began to represent Sigma. I always try to include a little bit about the United Nations. It seems so relevant now. Next slide. And the charter, which is 1945, and if you read the Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, is just like so needed now. And it's a shame that these goals keep going. Michael, next slide. This is the preamble to the charter: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, to establish conditions for justice, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom. I mean, this is so pertinent even now. Next slide. And this goes on to really specify how the United Nations can be effective in really bettering the life of the peoples of the world. Next slide. And people say, why nursing at the UN? Because while throughout the world, humanity continues to suffer from religious, ethnic, racial, and political discrimination, armed struggle, and atrocities, within the nursing profession, the values of altruism, social justice, and humane service predominate. And so to me, it's completely fitting. Next slide. And this is from Florence Nightingale, who said, health is not only to be well, but to use well every power we have. And so I've used that as kind of guidance for whatever opportunity I have at the UN, in terms of not necessarily real power, but the power of attention and interest. Keep going, next slide. So this is my favorite sculpture at the UN. And it's the first thing you see as you pass through security, and it connects completely to me and my own pacifist, anti-military kind of sentiments. Keep going. This is unknown. There's one of these in my office. Peace, it does not mean to be in a place where there's no noise, trouble, or hard work. It means to be in the midst of those things and still be calm in your heart. And so that's something that I've learned how to do in terms of adjusting to the atrocities to which we're exposed. Keep going. Next slide. And of course, I'm a professor, so I use theory, and this is a complicated but elegant, beautiful theory of human ecology by Bronfenbrenner. And it just demonstrates the interaction between the micro, which is the individual, the family, the community, and larger political systems, and explains how each is influenced by the other in a reciprocal way. So by influencing macro systems of policy, culture, all of that, I'm changing within myself and growing as an individual. And we might want to use this in terms of some of our policy thinking. Okay, next. And the AACN has designated these 5 core values of professional nursing, and they all fit to me so that my practice of nursing is congruent with my work at the United Nations. And I try to engage students and faculty in the pursuit of these values, which are supposed to be incorporated in baccalaureate education, but they're not always. But stuff at the UN gives them an opportunity to see all of this in motion. Next slide. So there are a few different areas of affiliation, and I'm going to encourage you all to use me to help you get affiliated. There's the Department of Global Communications, and then they present NGO programs, briefings, events. And the next slide. Oh, this is back in the 60s, we turned on, tuned in, and dropped out. And you see this person slumped in the chair saying, now we tune in, turn over, and drop off. So most of my friends and colleagues are retiring and kind of this ilk, but I'm still turned on, tuned in, and not dropped out, but dropped in very much. Next slide. So this is ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, and this is a different kind of affiliation with the UN. And this is where we get to consult. It's a higher level communication, more complicated, but doable. And I try to help NGOs, organizations, universities have affiliations, because we really need an infusion of nursing wisdom and expertise into what often is a dysfunctional system, the UN. Next slide. And this is what we do as civil society. We don't necessarily make decisions, but we can accelerate national implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and hold partners accountable to their commitments. That's really very, very important. Next slide. And Congo is the conference of NGOs in consultative relationship with the UN. And that's the civil society sector that is supposed to influence policies and actions at all levels of the United Nations. And we work as a group. There are many activities that go on that are based in civil society, and we're vigilant about the General Assembly kind of cutting our access and our level of involvement to the UN. Next slide. And another thing that we do that you can all do, and I can help everyone do, is mission visits. It used to have to be in person, but now we can do it online, virtually, email, really working with the General Assembly members, member states, 193 of them, to sponsor resolutions, support resolutions. And for me, I bring awareness, especially to nursing issues in the world, but also in their countries. Next. These are some of the committees that I'm a part of, but there are many committees that nurses can join that meet monthly, sometimes more often, sometimes less often. Next. And I'm the chair of the NGO Committee on Mental Health and also Education, Learning, and Literacy. There are high-level meetings on non-communicable diseases, and there's no knowledge among the General Assembly members about any of this. So our contribution could be and should be enormous. Next. And some of what I did was not just be kind of a member of, as Sigma, but really move into leadership. So I was a director on the NGO Executive Committee, and this is me with some of my colleagues in one of these iconic rooms. This woman standing up just died at 102. She was still working with us. She was there when the United Nations was being formed, and she worked with us until she was about 98, 99. Next. This is how we can make a difference. This is a briefing in one of these iconic rooms. This was about SDS 4.7, which is Education for Global Citizenship, and I'm the moderator of this meeting. Next slide, please. You can't see me in that big one, but here I am sitting next to Ambassador Chunky Khan, and moderating a briefing of several hundred people on education for global citizenship. So it is possible to do very significant kinds of things there. Next slide. The other thing I was committed to doing was building a youth team. So we had these youth representatives, and I would have them come to a meeting, and it would be like a clinical. We'd have a pre and post conference. But the difference was, this is from a Sigma meeting. And as we got up to speak, we laughed and said to the audience, what's different about this group? And they all laughed, because everyone else in the audience was over 60 and gray haired, and it was very unusual to have at one of the, most important nursing conferences, the Sigma Nursing Research Congress, to have young people presenting. But I wanted to give them the opportunity to move right into that global stage of nursing leadership. And Gloria Chan, who's second from the left, was just inducted into the American Academy of Nursing as a fellow, which is amazing. Next slide. This was another area of contribution. We were selected, Sigma, and the Nightingale Initiative for Global Change, to consult at this conference about how to get an NGO really making a contribution. This was Samantha Powers, who was the US representative, who was really part of the leadership at the UN, and it was terrible when she left. It was a huge void. Next slide. I'm trying to rush because I have so many. This is another slide of our UN team. Gloria is standing there next to DJ. She's the one who just got inducted as a fellow. And we're with Somali Mom, who was a anti-trafficking crusader in Cambodia. But I really wanted these kids to be able to meet these people and engage with them at a professional level, not just kind of follow me along. Next slide. And I developed the concept of mutual reciprocal mentorship. Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. And so I really set up a different mentorship relationship with these kids, where I taught them and they taught me, and it wasn't just teaching me about social media and computers, which you see I'm still not good at, but really being able to engage in a different way that's very meaningful and very important. Next slide. And I also, my greatest pleasure is to bring young people in. So this was a thrilling moment. It was a one of these big briefings about the refugee crisis several years ago. And a student of mine, an undergraduate student who just graduated, wrote to me one day and said, Dr. Shaw, I'm following your advice. I'm moved by this crisis. I want to do something, and I'm not going to wait till I'm 50. I can't bring medical skills because there aren't any medical things, but I'm a Farsi speaker and I can help in some way. What do you think? Everybody says I'm crazy, I shouldn't go. But of course I encouraged her. And when the group was planning this big conference on the refugee crisis, I said, you don't have any young people presenting. And they said, oh, young people aren't doing anything. So it was my thrill to have her, and you can see her name is here, speak on the floor of the UN as a nursing school graduate. I think it was just after she took the NCLEX, doing work in a way that she could. Next slide. So this is 2016, which was a devastating political election for many of us. And my desire to be well-informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. And this was kind of the mantra for a while, but I was really caught up in this and was compelled even more to do what I could to improve situations. Next slide. We give comfort and receive comfort sometimes at the same time. And, I'm so interested, and Michael's interested in neuroscience about trauma. And that's what I've been studying for years. But now I'm really interested in the neuroscience of altruism and empathy. And I'm fascinated by that and really focusing on a whole different area, especially as relates to nursing and what happens inside of us as we care for others. Next slide. So this is now the new mandate of the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals that focus on 17 goals, 179 targets that focus on people, prosperity, peace, partnership, and planet. Let's move on. We could talk one day about the SDGs. SDG 3 is specific to us, healthy lives and well-being, and these are some of the targets, but we insist that all 17 Sustainable Development Goals relate to nursing in one way or another, and that nurses can contribute to every one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. At this time, nursing became really well known, and there was an initiative called Nursing Now. Our patron is Kate Middleton, and her mom was a volunteer nurse. Her grandmother was also. Her children have been delivered by nurse midwives. The royal doctor is there, but the midwives do the delivery, and she's very committed to nursing. So she helped to launch this great initiative. Next slide. That led to the Year of the Nurse 2020 to 21. And we were on a big roll until, go on, next slide. when they said 2020 would be the year of the nurse, they weren't joking. You know, we know what happened in the world in 2020. And so all of our opportunities for these big campaigns were, you know, sublimated because of COVID. Next slide. But we really had a place in the public that was unprecedented in terms of raising a voice for nursing. And so I continue to do that within the UN system and all around. And it's raising a voice for nursing really globally. And I think it's something that we could all do. Actually, I had a briefing scheduled for April of 2020, and I wanted to share with my non-nurse colleagues at the UN the breadth of what nurses could do, you know, that it wasn't simply bedside nursing, but some of the things that all of you do. And we had it all planned, and then COVID came, and the Department of Global Communication said, "You've worked so hard on this, it's a shame, but you know, we can't do it." And I said, "Well, I've heard of this thing called the internet. Couldn't we do it virtually?" And they said, no, that we don't have the capability. And I said, "But it's the fucking UN. Come on." "No, we can't do it." And so I said, "Well, if I can get it arranged for an IT perspective, can we do it?" And the University of Minnesota had a great tech team. They did the whole thing. We had a virtual conference. I think 700 people were registered, and it was the first UN meeting that was held virtually, a nursing meeting. It was fabulous. No nurses were there because April 2020, they were all working with some aspect of COVID, but it set the stage in another interesting way. For now, we do everything virtually, but a nursing program was really the first at the UN. Okay, next. So I've been able to establish relationships with nursing leaders, and this was years ago. Jean Watson said, "As nurses, we're bound to a covenant with humanity to honor the integrity of the whole person, to sustain compassion, respect, and health, and to employ these principles as a guide for informed moral action." And she, as a contemporary nursing theorist, really adds an aspect of validity and credibility to extending this for eco-caring and human caring as exemplars of global, national, and local policy. Next slide. Of course, we, you know, this, when you think about what brought me here, I love this slide. I've been using it for years, but it's so typical. Next slide. And this is really my life, that I was able to do all of this stuff as a single mother. My husband left with my last pregnancy, which was over 30 years ago. He just assumed because we had so much adversity, I was 10 years older, it was going to be a disaster. And so as a single mom, working full time, raising an angry adolescent, a disabled child, a newborn, I was able to do my job, to get a doctorate, and to do this work at the United Nations. However, this is how I looked and felt most of the time. So the aspect of self-care in all of nursing, I think, is just essential. And I just have a few slides to kind of demonstrate that. Next. I was doing a lot of adolescent work and work with people who were caring for adolescents. My body is not a temple, but an amusement park. So many of the things that help sustain us through rough times are really not great for the temple that is our body. Next. A janitor is saying, "I've been working here 20 years and I've never seen anyone in their nurse's break room." You know, we're the last to take time for ourselves and self-care. Next. And this is Jack Cornfield. You know, your compassion must include yourself, not just your compassion for others. Next. Remember to take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. I do some whole presentations on this. Next. And this is some of what I managed to do that cares for myself and others. This is the Lake Clinic of Cambodia. Next. And if you go to this website, it's fantastic. It's started by a nurse who started the Anchor Hospital for Children in Siem Reap, Cambodia, where I do a lot of work. And he set up this service that brings healthcare services to water dwelling villages. They do it on boats. It's now difficult because the lake is diminishing with climate change, but it's a very inspiring project that any of you could jump into for a week or two and get involved. But just go to the website. It's terrific. Next slide. These are colleagues I met more than 20 years ago in Thailand at a conference. And I continue to be in touch with them because I think that it's very important for us to really help nurses. I'm sorry, the conference was in Thailand, but the nurses are Cambodian. And next slide, I've established a long-term relationship with them, really helping to establish nursing in a systemic, standardized way in Cambodia. And any of you could go there. I use frequent miles to get there. I go there several times a year and do a presentation, or there are so many ways that we can help. This is, next slide, please, the Long Neck Tribe, it's called, and it's a fascinating, another cultural practice that's really interesting. And this is my son, Matthew, who I was pregnant with when we went to Thailand the first time, and he really wanted to have some experience seeing all the things that we always talked about. So I just encourage people to bring your children. You don't have to do these kinds of humanitarian endeavors without children. Next. And this is Nightingale again saying, let whoever is in charge keep this simple question in her head, not how can I always do the right thing myself, but how can I provide for the right thing to always be done? And this is what I think nursing leadership is. And this is our interest in policy, is not just to guide our own practice, but to make sure that we can provide for the right thing to always be done. Next slide. So what I've taken from all of this and how I manage it is Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in the world. And here are some of the ways that I'm able to do that. Next. I love this quote that says, we see patients not only as they are, but as they can be. And I see the world that way also. And I think it's really what makes me excellent at what I do, is this sense of imagination and vision, which I think always has to be connected with policy. And that's why we want to be involved in policy, not just for right now, but really to optimize how things can be for patients and humanity. Next. So this is something that when I was in Jordan one year, I always do something about perspective and perception. So do you see a musician or a girl's face? These were actually some schoolboys who gave me this picture. Can you see both? Because depending on how your brain works, you either look at this and see a woman, or you look at it and see a man playing a saxophone. And as you accommodate, you can see both things. But at first, you can't. You just see whatever your brain predominates. And I have lots of different slides like this to just point out that there's not one reality. I grew up thinking, there's reality, there are facts, that's that. But so much of it just depends on your own brain, your own experience, your own set of perceptions in terms of what you can see and notice. And our goal would be to be able to see both images in one picture. Next slide. And the other thing that keeps me thinking as social networks first came about is that connections through social networks transcend individuals and their own limitations, and that brains accomplish what no single neuron can do. So that's one of the overriding thoughts I have in the work I do, is that the brain can accomplish what no single neuron can do. Next slide. And another way of looking at that is enlightenment is when a wave realizes it is the ocean. And I have a whole other thing about that. You think you're a wave, but you're really the ocean. And that's another, predominating thought that's in me all the time and everything I do. Next slide. We're almost done. Oh, and this is just a funny one about youth. That's right, dear. Our ancestors had tails, in terms of youth and phones and cell phones and all that, I'm always looking back and looking forward. Next slide. And this is something that came out post-COVID when everyone said, oh, we're all in the same boat. Well, we're not. We're in the same turbulent sea, but every boat is different. And depending on the boat you're in, depends on the resources you have, the opportunity, to move around and all of that. So in a lot of the work that I do, I try to promote this idea. And this is my way of looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion. It depends on the boat you're in, and that determines what you need in terms of optimization. Next slide. And I do a lot of work in India also. I think we have to be attentive to nurses around the globe. And nurses in India are really suffering. They have very sound, good education, but they're seduced away to the West, to get nice houses and all that we can get. I don't own a house, I rent, but there's these thoughts of great material value. And so they're really in a big problem of how to sustain their own nursing workforce. And so I'm working with an educational foundation called the Akshar Foundation, and we're promoting the idea of nursing to elementary school, girls and boys. And now we're through high school, and it's a very exciting endeavor, but it's another way that any of us can contribute to our profession. Next. So Judith Shamian, who was the ICN president and is my best friend in the world now. When I first met her, she was introduced to me as the most important and powerful nurse in the world. She said several years ago, never has there been a time when the voices of nurses are more urgently needed at high levels of policy formation and decision-making than they are now. And she is an incredible champion for nurses at policy tables at every level. Next slide. And this is Judith on the right with the red hair, and Jean Watson. We were able to have a nursing event at the UN several years ago that awarded nurses for doing this work and really celebrated nursing at the UN. Next slide. And the voice at the policy table that we're interested in pushing right now is to influence decision-making processes and healthcare policies around resource allocation and access to healthcare for vulnerable populations. And there is no other profession, I think, better in a position to do that than nursing. Next. The problem with internet quotes is that you can't always depend on their accuracy, said Abraham Lincoln in 1864. And this is, there are a lot of young people who say, yeah, what? They don't get that Abraham Lincoln in 1864 could not have talked about the internet. But the UN through UNESCO is also involved in a very excellent information, disinformation, misinformation campaign that as nurses we can bring to our local environments. And it's really important, especially getting through to young people now or older people, because there are many things that my mom, who's 98 and a half, would say, and I'd say, Mom, that's not accurate. And she said, well, it must be. I read it on the internet. So next slide. This is another group that really works with policy. ANHE, the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, another new group is starting, Nurses for Planetary Health. They're primarily involved in policy at local and national and now global levels. But it's a way that we can all get involved. They're very active in California, and they're starting to be active in other parts of the world, but they have great materials, great information, and are very effective in terms of policy. Next. Okay, this is the last part. This is about Israel. I'm sorry that our former Israeli dweller isn't here now, but I've been in Israel since 2000, and I've been there probably, I think, more than 35 times. I was there very often during the Second Intifada, and now I'm on the phone with them every day around trauma, loss, and just the catastrophic experience of terrorism. Next slide. And this is, long ago. This is the theme in most of the Israel that I'm involved in, is coexistence. Next slide. Nurses in the Middle East is a phenomenal group, and they're kind of sponsored by Jean Watson, because it started with two nurses, Julie Ben-Menishti and Naila Hayek, and they were working kind of on opposite sides, and they had a patient who was in the hospital for about 3 months, recovering from an accident, and he had to be discharged to the Palestinian territories, and there was no mechanism to do that. And Julie said, if this was a patient anywhere else, I'd call the nurses, we'd set up a rehab plan, we would do all of this continuity of care. It's horrible that I have no one to call and no way to do that. And so the two of them started this Nurses in the Middle East as a way of collaborating. And they actually, what they were doing was illegal, because on the Palestinian side, it's illegal to communicate normally with the enemy. And so they needed Jean Watson to sponsor them as a middle person. You can go to the next slide now. And in most of the Middle East, people get along. This is an Israeli and an Arab nurse working with a Bedouin patient. And Nurses in the Middle East, keep going, has turned into a major organization. We don't need to talk about this, but keep going. I'm trying to speed up. Next slide. We've had this one already. Next slide. And this is Julie on the right and Naila on the left, with Judith Shamian and Jean Watson. I've had them come to the UN several times, and here they were honored for having an incredibly exemplary organization that works on collaboration. Each of them is very steeped in the policies and politics of their own country and ethnicity. But as nurses, they're able to just push that to the side to collaborate about patient welfare. And when I've had them present at the UN, I have goosebumps now. It's astonishing how they are the exemplars of the United Nations, and they're suffering very much now. Naila just was promoted last year to one of the highest positions in nursing in Israel, not in the territories. They were both working at the same hospital for quite a while. The major hospital there, Hadassah, has 25% Arab staff, and every sign in the hospital is written in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. And they, in one of the hospitals nearby, they brought us to a place where they said they from the Arab village right near there, they throw Molotov cocktails at us, all day, but then at night bring their grandmothers having a heart attack. It's just a very amazing kind of experience. But I honor them today and every day. And I would encourage you, every year there's a conference in February, Nurses in the Middle East, people from all around the world come. Jean is always there. Last year she couldn't. I don't know what's going to happen this year. We used to be in Jordan, but it again is illegal. Once they found out what we were doing after about 8 years, that we were actually collaborating with each other, we were threatened. So last year it was in Bethlehem. I don't know about this year, but it's certainly a group you can get involved with easily. Next slide. And, people ask me, students are still told they have to do 2 years in med surge, and I just say, go where your passion is. So my passion project right now is, next slide, is Be the Match. And SONSIO, which is the Society of Nurse Scientists, Innovators, Entrepreneurs, and Leaders, is sponsoring this local, regional, national, global campaign to raise awareness and engage racially, ethnically diverse nurses, nursing and medical students to add to the registry for stem cell and bone marrow life-saving donations. Next slide. This is in honor of my dear friend Cindy Stolmiller, who was a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing, my beloved friend in the trauma nurse world, I don't know, 40 years. And she's here with Jean at one of these celebrations we had. Cindy died 3 years ago, and she waited of leukemia. She waited a long time for a stem cell match. And she finally got it from a 30-year-old woman in Poland. It had to be the same ethnicity and genetic background. We didn't know if she got it sooner, if that would have changed the outcome. But while she was suffering, I said, Cindy, when you're better, we're going to have a campaign, because who better than nurses, student nurses, to donate stem cells and bone marrow? It's such an easy thing to do. It's just a cheek swab. And we had a whole plan for doing this among all schools of nursing around the world and medical schools. And unfortunately, she died, but I'm carrying this out. It's finally coming to a fruition. And I'm going to encourage everyone to bring this to your local area, whether it's a hospital, a school of nursing, a community. Anyone can do it. And we have educational materials we're presenting. We have a big conference, Santiago conference in October, where we're launching this globally. But it's another way of nurses taking care of each other, because it was just astonishing to me that we couldn't find anyone to save her life. And we have a friend who was a musician who died also 25 years ago, Michael Brecker, waiting for a bone marrow transplant. And so now it's so easy to do. We're hoping that this can make a difference and can engage student nurses, medical students, and nurses in a way to be globally involved on a policy and also an action level. Next. So this is kind of Jean. We're a reflection of each other's light. This is how I keep going, even dealing with atrocity. Next. And oh, this is just me and Jean. I meant to take this out. Next. And these are just, so many things that we can do within the UN context. Next. Many different things that nurses can do to become involved in the United Nations, especially now since we do so much virtually. Next. And just beware that one's mind, once stretched by a new idea, never again retains its original dimension. And, this is how I ended up where I am, is that my mind was stretched, and will be so forever. Next. Next. I saw Margaret Mead when I was in college at Boston University, and this is my mantra: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And when people tell me you can't change the world, I just refer back to this. Final slide. There's a sense of urgency. I hope you don't mind this language, but there is a real sense of urgency. Clearly, we have to change the world, and we have to do it today. We can't wait. We just can't wait. We have to use every day that we have to make the world different. And I believe that we can.